So Sam, me, Josh, and Gabe for the intro.
Uh,
hmm
Hello, folks, and welcome to the American Watchman Roundtable. I am one of the co-hosts here, Sam Whitfield.
This is Adam. I'm also one of the editors and co-founders of American Watchmen. Glad you guys could all join us.
this is Josh. You've all heard from me too many times on this show already.
And I am Gabe Icaboni, a founder and editor of American Watchmen, and I guess I'll be running the show tonight. Um, with that, I guess I'll take it and run with it. So this is part two of our election analysis, and we're going to focus a little bit on what the midterms in November meant for 2020 and Trump. So I guess I'll just open it up with a general question about the midterms a couple weeks ago and what it means from 2020, and we can go from there. So I guess I'll just start it off with just some insights that there's the commentary has about November, or I should say this November, has been a lot about how supposedly the Trump reelection campaign is in trouble because when you dig into the numbers, like the blue wall was supposedly rebuilt a little bit, and Trump had trouble with college educated women, and really the electorate is now polarized along rural and suburban, and how elements of Trump's coalition have basically left the GOP. So I guess I'll open it up to anybody who wants to take it. What do you put the prospects of Trump's reelection at, and what do you think of the midterms and how they'll impact 2020?
I feel like you're trying to bait me with this question, Gabe.
I
Uh,
always bait you, Josh.
if you gentlemen recall, I forget what month it was, but way back when we first did the whole tax reform bill, which I will admit is not all bad. I'm looking forward to getting a refund for the first time in 2 years now, without the individual mandate is gone. But if you'll remember, I wrote a piece saying that in spite of the bill's commendable aspects, that I thought the GOP was going to pay a pretty heavy price for it. And since I am not a astute observer of, looks like Sam just dropped out. Since I'm not, since I don't follow closely every congressional election, I wasn't able to be too very specific, but I did predict that we might lose one chamber of Congress over that bill. And I think that with regards to what you were saying about parts of the blue wall being rebuilt in the Rust Belt, that we're sort of seeing the fruits of that. If Trump gets elected as a non-traditional Republican and then spends the first 2 years governing as a mostly traditional Republican, then it doesn't go too well with him and those aspects of his coalition that were drawn to him specifically because he campaigned as somebody who wasn't a traditional Republican.
Adam, do you have any thoughts?
Um, Regarding this election and how it might affect the 2020, we still have the Senate, obviously. So with Ruth Bader Ginsburg getting out here soon, likely whether via retirement or other means, it looks like that Trump might be able to appoint another judge. I think, regardless of what happens in Congress and Senate, I do believe that everything else Trump has done can still help him solidify a victory in 2020, as long as he keeps getting good results.
Well, so on that note, to your points, Josh and Adam, do you view do you view the midterm results as a repudiation of Trump's policies or more his temperament? Because on the one hand, Josh, I know you're saying it is somewhat a repudiation of Trump's tax cuts and that policy of trickle down economics benefit the rich more than the regular Joe and Jane. So is what do you, I mean, and this is to you, Adam or Sam, do you view the midterms more as a repudiation of policy or Trump's temperament?
I would say it's
Well,
more of a repudiation on Trump's temperament because I mean, even several left-leaning newspapers, like Politico and even MSNBC and like Vox have written articles over the last year, not directly, but in a roundabout way, praising Trump's policy, saying that he's either winning or his policies are working. So I definitely think it's more repudiation regarding Trump's temperament or their view on his temperament.
I guess I'll let Sam speak since he's been absent.
Can you guys hear me? First of all, I kind of, I don't know what happened, but I cut out there. I gave this question about the temperament thing. This midterm was entirely about temperament. If you really think about it, that's all the left has done for the last 2 years. Basically, every criticism they've made of Trump has been about his temperament. And, understandably so. I mean, I think we've had plenty of instances where we on kind of the conservative side, can sometimes cringe, over some of the stuff he tweets or stuff he says. So I think this was entirely based on Trump's temperament, because if you look policy-wise, there's really nothing that the Dems had to run on policy-wise that they could point to. It was all, oh, look what a big bad meanie Trump was. So,
well, and so on the point of temperament and policy, do you see? I guess, Josh, you can answer this question for me, and then we'll piggyback or we'll build off it. But if Trump runs as a traditional Republican in 2020, say in an attempt to win back the suburban voters that he lost, or that Republicans lost this midterm, do you see him being reelected for a second term, or do you see him kind of having to be Trump 2016 but run on, say, his economic record while being more true to his populist tendencies? Or something in between, or Trump running as a hard populist to try and just eke out, get over the finish line?
Well, I don't think he can win back those more suburban Republican voters, and I'll kind of use my answer to also push back a little bit on Sam's comment, because at the end of it there, he said that because the key word that stood out to me was because Trump was a meanie. If you look at the way Trump's been since he was elected, since he was inaugurated, he's still certainly more rough around the edges than your average president is. But he's toned it down a lot since he was a candidate on the 2016 campaign trail. He's not near as what's the word I'm looking for? He's not near as fiery, let's say, as he was when he was on the campaign trail. He sort of tied his tie up a bit and became a little bit more quote unquote professional. And the people still hate him. And the thing about that is, when it comes to these kind of not policy related, but moral disdain, this moral disdain that they have for Trump because he's not part of their tribe, or he doesn't talk like somebody from their tribe, or whatever have you. It's once you've lost that, it's incredibly hard to get it back. I know I sent you guys a link on Tulsi Gabbard, and she's sort of the same thing, but for Democrats. She has betrayed them on quote unquote moral grounds, on moral issues, because she's willing to work with Trump, or she's willing to go and talk with President Assad in Syria. And even though she may agree with them on key policy goals of theirs, like universal health care or whatever, they still can't stand her and refuse to deal with her because she's betrayed the tribe, even if her policies haven't. And so I don't think you're going to see Trump get those voters back. I think our midterms just showed that. Because even after 2 years of Trump being more toned down and actually governing with those people's interest in mind, they still came out against him. So I don't see that as being a way for him to win re-election. I think it will require him to, and I don't know if that process starts in 2020 or if it starts now. I would say it starts now, because I don't see how he can run as the 2016 Trump again in 2020 if he hasn't actually gotten any of the stuff done that he said he would, like the $1 trillion infrastructure plan I always harp on, or like building the wall. And so I think we're going to see him try and as I've said before, work with a divided Congress in a bipartisan fashion to get some things done with Pelosi, like infrastructure, for example, in order to be able to run on some of that populist appeal again in 2020.
I think his chances of winning in 2020 also greatly depend on who he runs against in 2020 as well. Certainly, I think, at least from my observation, and I wrote about this right after the 2016 election, and I talked about this on, multiple podcasts, whether it's that I've appeared on. Trump's election, in my mind, was a direct response to the Clintonian politics, quite literally, and this whole idea that Hillary Clinton feels that she's owed a presidency in the White House because she's a Clinton or whatever. It would be there that she may run again in 2020. I think if she does, I don't think it'll be necessarily an easy victory for Trump, but I think he could win again just because Hillary is so, she's hated by universally everyone. But I think, if there's a kind of like a newer face in the Democrat Party, I don't know who that would be exactly. I'm not in the prediction game. But I think if it's someone who is like non-establishment lefty, I think Trump could have a much more difficult time in 2016.
I'm still holding to my prediction, and I'm not going to say 100%, but I'm going to say like 95%. I can almost guarantee that Kamala Harris will come out as the nominee just because she checks all of their little identity boxes.
I agree.
She might come out. Another name that I've been hearing a lot of over the last couple of days is Beto or Beto, whatever. Robert Francis O'Rourke is his real name. So,
well,
I don't understand the appeal of. Well, I kind of do because he's basically the fantasy of Blue Texas personified for them.
Right.
But he's basically just white Obama. And the problem with white Obama is he doesn't click the identity boxes, so they're not going to get those SJWs that they're so dependent on, even though they can't deliver a national win. They're not going to be able to get them through a primary.
I mean, the Democratic primary, you have to win over a large number of black voters, and that's what Bernie Sanders couldn't do against Clinton, and it's what Clinton couldn't do against Obama. But Josh, I do agree with your point. I think it will be Kamala Harris. So assuming that those suburban voters from the midterms are lost for Republicans and Trump, how does Trump get reelected then? Because I guess I'll put on my personal thinking cap here and push back against that a little bit, only because these voters already voted for Trump once when it was a choice between him and another Democrat, not when it was something more dispersed and say more cultural like a midterm. So if we let's assume that those suburban voters are lost, how does Trump win? Because that's a huge chunk of the GOP coalition, not even including the voters that Trump has brought into the party.
Is this directed at me?
Well, it's directed to anybody, but you can answer first.
Well, I was hoping I wasn't because this one's hard. But I guess I'm going to go Sam's route and say that I'm not into the prediction game anymore. But because I'm not sure, I don't have the numbers of how many. For example, ideally, in an ideal world, I would just say that Trump could manage to completely take the working class with him. And I think the GOP kind of already has over 50% of that. Again, I'm not the numbers guy. Because if you look around the Democratic Party from 2016 onwards, for sure, if not sooner than that, they're not really a party for workers anymore. It's rich coastal elites. And but the problem is a lot of those coastal cities tend to be where the population centers are. So I'm not going to name a specific group. I'm going to maybe punt the ball to somebody else. I'm not sure who Trump would have to take on that. I know he would definitely need his populist base and more workers, but I'm not gonna. Yeah, that's my answer on that one.
I think Trump is going to need to take the women's voting base in 2016. I mean in 2020, because as much as I hate to say it, the left keeps banging this gender, as like a big demographic, specifically with women, and so that might be a voting block that he needs to pick up in 2020 as well. I don't have the numbers to back that up either, but like that, I in the era of Me Too, that's going to be a big thing in. So
I think Sam raises an interesting point because, and this is my whole realignment. I don't know what word I'm looking for, but my whole realignment deal. And I have noticed that because of the way for the revolution eats its own kind of thing going on with feminists, I've noticed that, for example, 10 years ago, a feminist wouldn't have come out and said that an advertisement on a New York subway station of a woman in a bikini was bad. That would have been people on the right saying that was bad, and they'd be defending it as a woman's right to show her body off. But now they've gone and done a 180, and I don't know if that would be enough to win an election. Again, I'm not the numbers guy. I don't know how many women voters there are, or how many women are even motivated to vote by that kind of thing. But that is an interesting point that Sam raises.
Well, so do you, let me, Adam. Well, first, do you have anything to add, Adam?
I have nothing to add to this point now.
Okay, so let me sort of steer this to kind of recent events, and so maybe see if that's playing a part in it, and whether Trump has already kind of initiated his 2020 reelection campaign and isn't as tone deaf as the elites or the media would like us to believe. So it was either last week or I think it was this week where Trump's policy, and Josh, you can help me out with this if you remember exactly, but there was a judge in San Francisco, a district judge, who basically put a blanket ban on Trump's immigration policy.
He halted. He tried to halt the processing of political asylum applications.
Right. So the judge issued a permanent injunction, which means the Trump administration can't do it. And in response, Trump came out and said that there are Obama judges and they're stopping my policies, which brought John Roberts, of all people, into it. And he said, no, there aren't Obama judges. And Trump responded back and went, yes, there are Obama judges. So I guess my question for you guys is that Trump trying to signal to conservatives and Republicans like he did in 2016, hey, you don't have to like me personally, but this is the thing I'm doing for you that you can stomach voting for me on, which is there are liberal judges who continue to try and legislate their way of life on you, and I'm the one who's trying to get rid of them. So that like me on that, and hopefully that outweighs the other stuff. Do you guys see that kind of as Trump already trying to position himself in 2020 to maybe win back some of the voters that the Republicans lost, say, to an O'Rourke in Texas?
Well, I think it's interesting because I'll put it this way. So on the one hand, I think everybody who's a pro-lifer will automatically want to say, yeah, well, even if we disagree with Trump on everything else, we'll vote with him on that because it's important that we get a pro-life Supreme Court and that we can also remove this legislating from the bench down the line. but it sort of goes back to well, there's good public policy and then there's good election campaigning. And I guess for me, the answer would be that, yeah, going back to the Supreme Court and going back to the courts again is a good strategy to get reelected, because there's a wide, even though we're divided on everything else, even within our parties now, there is still pretty wide consensus in both parties on where each party stands on abortion and on the courts in that regard. And so I think candidates in both parties try to play to that. The problem is, though, what if in our case anyway, Republicans' case, what if we're getting those justices on the court, but we're not getting results? I know I've complained to you guys before that we had the majority on the Supreme Court, we had it in Congress, we had it in the White House, we had it in state legislatures across the country, and still nothing was really substantively done to go at Roe versus Wade. There were good efforts pecking away at abortion rights at lower state levels. I can't remember what it was now, but I saw Trump did something that was praiseworthy on that front a few days ago, or a few weeks ago, my bad. But I can't remember what exactly it was, but it still wasn't, going after Roe versus Wade, which was the whole premise for voting for him for the Supreme Court. So maybe that might be a part of his 2020 re-election strategy coming out already. I'm just not entirely sure that that's necessarily. It's not good policy if you're running on these things and then not doing them. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I'm tempted to say that there might be some people eventually who say, well, look, we voted for you last time for Supreme Court seats. We got those Supreme Court seats and we still haven't seen the changes we'd like to see. So that's my sort of cautionary tale on that as to whether or not that trick will work again. Although, to be fair to him, it has worked consistently to help keep people voting in our country for the two parties for a long time now.
Well, that's true. What I from what I've seen in terms of just I guess you can look at it two ways. You can look at the way I phrased the question, which is it trying to reach out to traditional conservatives who, say, for example, just might not like Ted Cruz's personality and don't like Donald Trump's, or it can also just be Trump playing to his base again because of the visceral reaction to, oh my goodness, there's the guy in the White House, and oh, he's attacking a judge, and oh, he's disrupting our democratic norms. I guess I've just seen enough now from Trump to know that he does things for a reason. And whether the reason is to draw back some elements of the coalition or whether it's Trump running for 2020, I don't think he just did it because he was annoyed. I think there's something more at play there.
Well, Gay and Josh, I'm surprised that no one has brought this up here, but I find it kind of interesting that he got into a fight with John Roberts about all of this, because if you remember, John Roberts is the justice who pretty much sold us down the river, as the saying goes, when it came to Obamacare, and basically let Obamacare become a thing. And so, after that happened, at least in my mind, and pretty much in the mind of every conservative that I know personally, in the commentary field and politically, John Roberts, we basically all shunned him for that, and for the right reason. So, I mean, the way that I see it, and I've talked to a couple of people, it's kind of like, oh, he's being mean to John Roberts. Oh, that guy kind of deserves it because he screwed us over on Obamacare. So, I don't really see too many conservatives jumping on board to defend John Roberts from Trump. In fact, kind of the opposite. So
I guess more to Gabe's original point as to whether or not this would help him win back those suburban voters. I'll put it this way. So Trump ran in 2016 and put many of them off by running as a non-traditional Republican on most of the other issues. But when it came to his stance on the courts and abortion, which, let's be honest, that's when people hear the courts, that's what they think. That's what they immediately think of for most of the Republican voters. When it came to that issue, he was mainstream Republican, and that's good in that particular case.
Well,
as far as I'm concerned, but I don't. I mean, but how is he? How is it going to win those voters back if Trump is going to something that never got them angry in the first place about him?
well, yeah. That's a good point. That's what I want to know. And the other thing to point out about abortion, Josh, is I love this whole notion that people have that we can just simply if we got enough Supreme Court justices, or if we can somehow repeal Roe v. Wade, that will be the end of it. Roe v. Wade has become more than a political battle. This is where I talk about on my show the intersection of popular culture and politics. And I don't know if any of you know who Andrew Klavan at the Daily Wire is, but he talks about this a lot too, how on issues with abortion, legislation is not nearly enough to stop it. We need to reach out, in the culture too. I don't want to get too sidetracked, seeing as how this is a policy show, but I will say that I don't feel like we'll make any real progress on getting rid of Roe v. Wade until there's more of a popular culture shift on getting rid of that.
Well, here's what I'm going to say to you, Sam, and I'm probably one of the few pro-lifers who will actually come out and say this. Just like if you ban guns, there will still be gun crime and there will still be criminals getting their hands on guns. If we ban abortion, which I do support, there will still be abortions, albeit illegal ones.
Right.
But the thing about it is that it will be less common. It'll be more difficult. A lot of women aren't going to be lining up to have a coat hanger stuck inside of them at the risk of their own health in a back alley somewhere. They're going to be more likely to consider maybe an orphanage. But the thing is, we're never, I'm speaking as a Catholic and as a Christian, we're never going to, on this earth, achieve a place through any policy or cultural outreach or whatever that completely gets rid of evil things happening. Until right. The end of time, it's going to keep happening because of man's fallen sinful nature. But what the role of government in this case is to send to set a moral example of what we as a society think is okay. We don't have legal slavery, but we still have slavery here. There's still sex slavery going on in the United States, but we as a society have made the decision to say that that's not something we're okay with. That's illegal. The majority of us aren't fine with it. And so that's why we want to outlaw abortion, not because we believe that it's going to magically make all of them stop.
No, and I completely agree with you on that. I'm not, as both a Christian and as a conservative. I'm just saying that maybe I worded it poorly, but I feel like that's kind of the apprehension, maybe that some lawmakers are having when it comes to getting rid of abortion, is the potential blowback from the loud minority. So.
Well, let's keep in mind though that it seems like we're dovetailing we're dovetailing the conversation on judges to one issue, which is abortion. And Josh, I know it's an issue you care a lot about, but there are a lot of issues that the courts touch that have nothing to do with abortion, though, that still touch on cultural issues that are important to a lot of people. And I know
that's the case. I'm just making the point that when you bring the court up, and the press coverage on this shows it all the time, they immediately go to Roe versus Wade.
You're right. I don't disagree.
Right. It's not abortion. That's what comes to people's mind. They don't start thinking, oh, no, Trump's going to get rid of that justice who decided that he'd rule in favor. Give me a court ruling here, Gabe. I don't know that many. You know what I mean. Our listeners know what I mean. Right. Yeah.
Well, gun rights. Heller versus Chicago, I think. Citizens United. I mean, those are a couple cases, but those are cases where I think a lot of conservatives, regardless of how they feel, say about abortion, I think that is kind of what, if you focus on the courts, what say a Trump or another Republican would be trying to sort of subtly hint at is, hey, if I put these people on the court, they agree with your way of life. They're not going to try and tell you how to live it.
I guess as a matter of policy, I would prefer that the judges agree with my way of life. But I think as a matter of policy, as a policy kind of wonk guy, I would be a little bit more enthusiastic if the president came out and said, how about we rethink the way our judges, how we're selecting these judges? Are we having them selected by people who are elected like me? Or are we going to have them selected on professional credentials and criteria? Because it seems to me that the courts have always been political, no doubt. But is that not because the way we've chosen to select many of these justices is through a political office?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess to me, if you really want to solve the problem long term, you could go out and say, well, I think it's time we change the way we select our justices and our judges in this country. I don't know how you would do that and reach a consensus, because I know whenever it comes to independent bodies, people seem to get very upset. I know in Nebraska, we have that issue over gerrymandering every time it comes up. But I mean, that to me, that's a more substantive solution than just saying, I'm going to pick judges who have a finite amount of time on the bench until that will agree with us for 10, 20 years, whatever, and then we're all going to have to worry about this again. It seems like putting a Band-Aid on the problem to me.
Well, to be fair to Trump, he actually has he hasn't put a lot of political capital behind this, but he has tried to sort of suggest rethinking how we select justices or what the criteria is or how long they serve by suggesting at one time that, say, maybe we break up the Ninth Circuit. Now, I know the Ninth Circuit is the most liberal court in the nation, and so that is, of course, how the media jumped on it, which is, oh, look, Trump's trying to break up this huge liberal circuit court. But Trump has suggested kind of what you have, Josh, which is a way around it or some sort of reform, because obviously it's not working if, say, a district judge in San Francisco can basically just tell the president of the United States your policy doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Let's now, to loop this back, and Adam, I know you got to go. Do you have any closing thoughts?
My closing thoughts for the evening is basically the same thing I was talking about before. I don't think necessarily that the midterms are any kind of barometer on how Trump's election is going to go in 2020. However, I do think that Trump needs to do a little bit better about reaching out to the minorities and the women and everything to be able to get more of a voter base than he had before.
Fair enough.
You know who we could reach out to? Gabe, I know you know that this is my other personal pet project, but maybe Sam and Adam don't know. We could reach out to Muslims and have a coalition of the faithful. But I don't know if everybody would agree with me. I know Sam and I probably disagree heavily on that issue.
Well, yeah. Go ahead, Sam. Sorry.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the coalition of, reaching out to Muslims, because I don't necessarily have a problem with that with secular Muslims necessarily.
Here, think of it this way, though, Sam. How silly would it be if I said to you, for example, there are some Muslims who would come out and say, you know what, I'm pro-life because abortion goes against my faith. Catholics work with them all the time on when we can on more local issues. But how silly would it be to say, oh well, you know what, we can't be having those kind of religious people in our country. We need to have secular Catholics. We need to have secular Muslims in the country. I think and this is a whole topic for another podcast, but I think after 9/11, we've sort of unfairly painted all Islam as some sort of terrorist cult when it really isn't.
that certainly would be an interesting topic for another podcast. I mean, I'm not saying all Muslims are terrorists, but you know, it certainly is a interesting proposition to get like a coalition of a religious that might not go over well with like more atheist groups. I don't know. Yeah,
I think you're right. I think that's a divide, and I know, again, topic for another podcast, but there are some books and studies that have come out lately, not specifically Catholic ones, so I'm not doing bias confirmation here, although there have been ones from our perspective on it as well. But there have been some indications that faith is starting to play a more major role in politics, both domestic and international, in recent years, and it's sort of a trend that they expect is going to continue. For the Vatican, that's meant more and more cooperation with the Muslim world because they're rapidly growing, and also because we've already had a fantastic working relationship with Iran for the last 30 years. But that's, again, another topic for another time. But
I'll just say before we move off this topic, because it is a topic for another time, I think you would have to do a lot of work to break Muslims out of the identity politics that they've kind of been sucked into to get them to start voting based on their faith. But with that said, so we have about 15 minutes left. So I know, Josh, you don't want to do this, and Sam, I don't know how you feel about it, but I am going to ask you to put on your prediction thinking caps with me, and sort of predict, based on what we've seen, what kind of different scenarios look like based on who the Democratic nominee is, based on some recent events. So I'll just take Kamala Harris, for example. She recently came out with a policy, and Josh, you can correct me if you've heard this or I'm a little bit off, but that's basically every American would get almost like a universal income. Does that sound familiar?
I didn't hear about that one. The last time I heard about her and a specific policy was when she put forward that kind of funny tax cut for quote unquote middle and lower class families, which she defined as being everybody who makes $100,000 a year or more. Right. Which maybe if you're married, I can see that.
Right.
But,
yes. No. It's correct. You're right. So that is what I'm thinking with her. It was Cory Booker, I think, who came out with the policy that I'm thinking of. But Kamala Harris came out with the policy about giving every American almost like an earned income tax credit if they earn under $100,000. In nature, that's a fairly, I mean, I guess it depends how you define populist, but that is a fairly populist measure depending on how it's implemented. So is that like, how would Trump run against that, or is that is that Harris or Democrats trying to kind of get back some of that populist mojo that they lost to Trump in 2016?
Well, here's the thing, Gabe. It's the exact same kind of problem that I laid out with Trump earlier when I said that he's going to have a hard time winning back those voters that had left him over the moral or cultural reasons or whatever. The Democrats have the same problem, but sort of with the exact opposite group of people. Because, and you and I have discussed this before, sure, I would wager that almost everybody in Trump's base would support that kind of policy. I know that I probably would. But at the same time, if that policy is being presented by a woman whose campaign very likely will be run on bashing white people and pushing radical transgenderism and, the usual SJW celebrity causes. If she's having that kind of policy with that kind of campaign, I highly doubt it's going to win them back the voters they lost because, like I said, when you've clicked off on that sort of moral box, when you punched, it's kind of a head versus the heart kind of thing. And I know that a lot of us who are more policy focused like to always think that people just think with their heads, but people are not rational like that all the time, especially not the average voter. And so they, even if it is presented, for example, I wouldn't vote for Kamala Harris. No matter how great that policy is, I would not vote for Kamala Harris simply because of her social position, which to me, as a Catholic, it would be a sin for me to vote for her. And there are many other people who are like that. Or if they don't have a religious reason, they would say, "Well, you know what? You think I'm a racist hick out in the middle of the woods who doesn't know anything and needs to go and get out of the way." Or you think I'm a white male who doesn't deserve to have a voice in the national conversation anymore. I don't care if I think your specific policy here is good. I'm not going to vote for you. It's the exact same problem Trump's going to have winning his back. And this is why I think as we discussed last time, this realignment early in its infant stages, though it may be, it's going to start to gradually speed up the closer we get to 2020, or after 2020, when it becomes apparent that both sides are having a hard time getting these voters back that they lost.
Well, do you think they're in? I guess that leads into, and this is, I admit, a concern of mine, is if say you're right, Josh, I honestly don't know how Trump would win because there are not enough rural voters to put Trump in the White House or any future presidential Republican into the White House unless that realignment along class starts to sort of eat into the racial divide that also defines our politics. So
I'm glad you bring that up because that allows me to finally answer your question from earlier.
All right, here we go.
And, well, you had to kind of lead me to it, but you did remind me now. So as we've discussed before, you know that I was very excited about, I believe Pew called them the Faith and Family Democrats or whatever. They're typically Hispanic, typically African-American. In other words, non-white. They're the kind of people Ocasio-Cortez didn't win. And they tend to be economically downscale. And so, as you said, there aren't enough rural voters. So even though Trump won in 2016 and we like to all sit around and imagine the Republican demographic problem just vanished overnight, I think maybe what the midterms, if they showed us anything, it might be that those problems didn't vanish, but we're closer to a solution now than we were at the end of the 2012 election cycle. And it's very possible, I think, that you can see perhaps Trump getting more of these downscale faith and family coalition people from the Democrats and winning them over and maybe making the GOP valid in some more of the, I believe you called them what did you call them last time? I forgot again.
Not
the suburbs, but the...
Oh, exurbs?
No, not exurb. This is where the faith and family voters are living, the African-American and Hispanic voters that Ocasio couldn't win.
Well, I just call them working class neighborhoods. Oh, boroughs. You're known as
boroughs. You use boroughs, yeah. So I think Trump might be able to make the GOP. It's a possibility. It's one I would hope his advisors are certainly looking into. We might be able to make the GOP valid again in some cities in the borough regions or districts or whatever you want to call them. And that's basically, if I had to go back and answer your question earlier, those would be the people I'd be looking to. And I would also throw in, because we kind of mentioned it, the Muslims, because I did read an article after 2016 where a bunch of them in New York were very upset with the Clinton campaign and said that they shouldn't take her vote Democrats shouldn't take their vote for granted, specifically because of the push for transgender nonsense and gay and abortion and stuff like that. So, although that would be in its very early stages, like we said. So those would be the people I'm looking for. The GOP will become more racially diverse, I think. Although saying that, I don't think it's going to be diverse in the way that word is interpreted by SJWs, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And Sam, you might know better than me, but I mean, because you live in Florida, I think I think the midterms kind of showcased a case study of that with Republicans maintaining their hold in Florida, in that, you had Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott win almost 60% or win over 60% of the Hispanic vote as they were getting killed among college-educated women. I mean, they couldn't have won without getting Hispanic support, which was assumed to not be there.
Florida is a very interesting case, and actually, specifically with Cuban Americans here, Josh. Cuban Americans, Josh, are basically like your, they're basically like your ideal demographic, Josh. They're very socially conservative, but they're also a lot of them are working class. So, and I mean, they're basically all.
You can come out and say it, Sam. You don't have to be afraid of saying they're socially conservative, but economically to the left. The left is not always a toxic word.
They're more economically to the left, but I do want to make the distinction for our listeners, as Josh has made before, that does not mean that they're communist either, because lots of them are afraid of communism, and yet they're very more economically liberal. And a lot of them are sick of the identity. A lot of them are sick of the identity politics. I think a big thing also that really kind of helped conservatives here is the fact that Andrew Gillum here in Florida basically tried running as Obama 2.0 for Florida, basically to the point where like he was even trying to like change his speech patterns to even kind of sound like Obama and have that same charismatic gravitas. And it was an extremely close race. I won't discount that, but I do think that for now there are enough conservatives here in Florida to hold us. The thing that does worry me, though, is as more coastal elites from California and New York who are liberal, as they continue to move here to Florida, and you're seeing this in Texas here too, the races will continue to get closer and closer. Beto.
Well,
if I can make a final point before if we go over 9, we go over 9. I'll be fine with that for this one. But I think if I can clarify something for Sam, because you kind of contradicted yourself there. You said the Cuban voters were economically more left wing, but then you followed up by saying they're economically liberal, which doesn't jive. I think more here's more maybe what you were trying to say, and this doesn't really apply to Cubans specifically because they're not. In some regards, Cuba is this case, in others, not so much. But put yourselves in the shoe of an immigrant that has come to the United States from a Latin American country or a European country even. And you're used to having certain, certain privileges or benefits that are in those countries, but that aren't here. In other words, where the social safety net is superior. The reason they come isn't because the social safety net can't help them anymore. It's because there aren't jobs in most cases. I talked when I was working at Walmart, there was a young Hispanic woman. I think I've mentioned her story on the show before. But her dad walked all the way up here from Mexico barefoot, not because he couldn't make a living there. I mean, he could, but it wouldn't be a very fulfilling one. There's no jobs. He could make a living sitting on and collecting a government check. But at the end of the day, and the labor movement has always understood this, people work because people want to go out and do something meaningful. They want to have a purpose. When I was out of college, I spent about, I want to say maybe 3 or 4 months just looking for a job, only a job that my degree would qualify me for. And I ruled out the other ones, and I swiftly got bored of that. And that's how I went to Walmart. So I would have something fulfilling to do during my days. And so you get people who come from these countries looking for work usually because either we've bombed their country into oblivion like in Syria, or we've sort of crippled their economy, like we see in a lot of places in Latin America, in order to drive them up here where they can become cheap labor. They come up here looking for work, they settle here, and then a lot of them look for same kind of benefits, the same social safety net, the same sense of security, and they find out it's not quite the same here in the United States as it is in, say, Europe or Latin America. And so you get this kind of voter who is socially conservative because the culture is strongly Catholic down south, and also at the same time leaning a bit more to the left because perhaps also from Catholic social teaching, which is much more prominent outside of the United States and which leans left on economics. But they're socially conservative and they're economically to the left because they've had that safety net and they don't understand why it's not here in America yet. You always hear that comparison. Well, every other country in the world has it. Why don't we? It's sort of that same thing playing out. They come here and they wonder, well, why doesn't America have that? They should have it. So.
Well, and it's also how they're integrated into our political system. I mean, Josh, I've written articles on this and how a first generation immigrant will behave differently than their children and their children's children, and how they assimilate into the political culture will determine their voting behavior and their policies. I think, for example, that would be true of, and it's the opposite way when, for Cuban Americans, for example, they sort of went the opposite route in which they came from Cuba. They were very conservative when they came here. They voted that way, but their kids are actually less conservative than they are. And whereas now with Florida in particular, Sam, you have sort of a divergence among Hispanics now with the older Cuban Americans being more conservative in some ways, not every way. But then you have Puerto Ricans who are socially conservative, but they are economically to the left because of their nation and where they come from. But younger Puerto Ricans, according to the exit polls I've seen, actually are more economically conservative. So for the first generation immigrant who comes in this country, I think that's true, Josh. I think that's how they assimilate. For the later generations, there tends to be somewhat of a backlash to what the first generation, what their tendencies were, just because future generations have more assimilated into the political culture of the nation, however that may look.
I think I think you're right, and I did kind of confuse my words there when I was making my statement. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a huge difference between generations as well. I think I think first generation immigrants and then first generation Americans who are Cuban American or Puerto Rican, I think, well, specifically with Cuba, I think first generation Cuban Americans are much more aware of the evils of communism and social justice leftism, because they're listening to their parents and they're much more aware of it. But on the flip side, I've also noticed that, let's say, second or third generation Cuban Americans who are now our age and younger are more open to social justice and some of this negative communist type stuff that was going on.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment? Because I think I need to clarify something again. I mean, maybe you were here last week, so maybe you heard me rant about this. But the notion that people who come from Cuba are fleeing because they have seen social justice warriors like in America is nonsense. Because right now, and Gabe, you heard me rant about this last week. Right now, Cuba, after Raul Castro has stepped down and they've got their new president, they are debating a new constitution. There are two major things in the constitution that stand out. One, it doesn't end the Communist Party's stranglehold on power, but it does say that they're not going to pursue communism as an end goal anymore. and it also legalizes not homosexuality, gay marriage. So you would think that left-wing organizations would be upset, that the Socialist International or whatever would be upset to see Cuba going the way of China, unfortunately, and choosing to throw workers under the bus in order to get some more capital on the country. But they aren't. Instead, they come out and they say, oh, they're legalizing gay marriage. How wonderful. So under the Castros, people were not fleeing from social justice warrior stuff like that because it wasn't there. Because the Castro government is illiberal. It doesn't promote homosexuality, for example, like that. So I mean, and you've got a point that they were fleeing from communism, perhaps, but communism and social justice nonsense are not the same thing. And we sort of, I've discussed it with Gabe more than I have with you, Sam, but you see that sort of with Corbyn in the United Kingdom. You've got the material, and then you've got the moral left, and the moral left is liberal. The material left is left or leftist. The material left is concerned about economic matters, Corbyn, Castro, and then you've got the liberal left, like here in the United States, which is so totally obsessed with pandering to minorities and with promoting abortion and transgender nonsense and all this, that they totally forget about workers and their rights and they throw them under the bus.
Yeah,
so people aren't fleeing from Cuba because they're social justice warriors there. It just doesn't happen.
Well, but you're right, but it's also strange kind of the marriage of communism and, I guess, cultural Marxism here, I guess. So, and we could continue ranting, but I mean, long story short, getting back to my point on Florida, though, I think it is definitely kind of, it certainly surprised lots of people that Florida still stayed red. I wasn't that surprised by what I will say is I was relieved more than anything that we kept Florida, but it was super close. So we'll have to see what happens in 2020 and then again in 2022. So,
well, I think the thing with Florida is it is a micro. To me, Florida represents a microcosm of how during this realignment process and during this process where I would argue Republicans are at a disadvantage running nationally, it is a microcosm of how a Republican can win, which is you run. I mean, I think I called him the giant killer, Rick Scott, because let's see, he's now won, I think, 3 elections by less than 2%. You don't run as a doctrinaire conservative on everything. You run as a conservative and call yourself a conservative, but the message you make, your pitch to different groups, is meaningfully different. You don't run to a bunch of Puerto Ricans and go, "Hey guys, we're going to cut your welfare and we're going to make sure that that if you don't work, you don't get any government benefits," to a group of people who are used to a strong social safety net, or run to a bunch of Cuban Americans and go, "Yeah, we want to open up trade relations with Cuba." I think I take Florida more as a microcosm of how a Republican can win right now. 10 years from now, that might not matter, but right now, Florida, I think, is representative of how a Republican can win nationwide, and by extension, that means how Trump can win nationwide.
Yeah, I think you're certainly right, Gabe. It's interesting that you call Rick Scott the giant killer. I think that's an incredibly appropriate name. And what's interesting is Rick Scott was actually the first kind of outsider businessman, as far as I know, to really go up against the political establishment, much like Trump did, and win office. In fact, it's interesting because back when I had my doubts about whether or not Trump could pull off, winning the presidency because of his, lack of political experience, my neighbors all said, well, Rick Scott never held political office. He was a businessman prior to this, and so I guess, yeah, you're absolutely right that Florida is kind of a microcosm of how Republicans can win. So.
Yeah. So I guess I guess we'll start wrapping this up in terms of final thoughts. So Josh, do you see, and then I'll open this up to you, Sam, and then I'll kind of close this out. Do you Josh see Trump being elected in 2020? And I know I'm asking you to put your prediction cap on. Do you see Trump being reelected in 2020 if he doesn't expand his coalition somehow? So regardless of who the Democrat is, because you can put in whoever you want 2 years from now, but assuming things stay static, do you see Trump getting reelected? And if you don't, how do you see Trump being reelected?
Well, I don't see him winning. Excuse me. I don't see him winning if I would agree with you. He needs to expand his base. I don't see him winning if he doesn't. But as we kind of discussed, I think, and this is maybe my preferred way of doing it. So I will admit there is confirmation bias in my own thought process here. My preferred way of going about it would be, as we sort of discussed, getting those faith and family voters and pulling the party in that more economically left-wing direction while keeping it nice and socially conservative. I don't know if that process will be complete by 2020 or not. That said, though, and I wanted to mention this earlier, but I didn't know how to squeeze it in, so I'm kind of glad you asked this question. Right before Adam went off, I think Trump's going to win again, but I see his presidency as almost like a mirror image of Obama's, where I can imagine the GOP, because even though Trump is not, even though he's governed as one, I'd still say it's fair to say he's not a traditional Republican. Um, Even though he isn't, most of the people we have in Congresses and state legislatures, unfortunately, still are. And I can see it being almost like Obama, where there's a gradual erosion at every other level, but we somehow keep the White House. And that's just how I see this presidency playing out as a narrative. But maybe I'm wrong on that. But I would agree that he needs to expand his coalition, and the preferred way I would like to see that happen myself, speaking for myself, would be with getting those faith and family coalition voters from the Democrats.
Sam?
I definitely think that Trump can win again. I do agree with Josh that he does need to expand his base. I think one thing that certainly helped in the midterms, at least here in Florida, was strangely enough, I know a lot of Black people who actually voted Republican here in Florida because they were sick of Blexit. So I mean, they were sick of the identity politics, and so they took up the whole Blexit mantra. That's what I meant to say.
Sam, if you ever run for public office, this is the moment that's going to haunt you for the rest of your life. It's just like when Rick Santorum came out and he had kind of a slip like that where he said something about blacks, and then he's like, "That's sick of the black." This is the moment that haunts you, Sam.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm not running for political office. I've said way too much stuff that could get me in trouble. So, but then again, Trump won miraculously, so who knows? But I I think Trump can. I think Trump can win. He will have to expand his base. I think if the left continues down this road of social justice BS, which no one really cares for, I think he'll have an easier time winning. I think if they do tighten up their ship a lot more and focus more on economic issues, it's going to be tougher for Trump to win. But at this point, things are going pretty well, and I think enough people are seeing that his policies do work. So, I mean, we still have 2 years out. Something major could happen, but I think he's pretty safe to win as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree. I think, I mean, at right now, if you look at the midterms as kind of a referendum on Trump, um, I think he's no worse than 50-50 to be reelected. And that's kind of on the low end. I think I agree with both of you guys. I think he does need to expand his base. I don't think he's going to do it in one traditional direction. I think he'll win back. I do think he'll win back some suburban voters that he lost, probably not a lot. I think he'll bring out his base more than we saw in the midterms. And I think to a degree, I think we will start to see what we saw in 2016, which was him overperforming among minorities in comparison to what we have seen in the past, like with the McCain versus Obama or Romney versus Obama, because I think the political paradigm, as you say, Josh, a realignment has somewhat occurred. I don't think it will be done in 2020. I agree with you, Josh, but I think it will have started enough that it will give Trump that opening he needs to pick up just enough voters in key states to win like he did in 2016. I don't think he's going to win the popular vote, but I do think he'll win the Electoral College. And then we can hear about how he's an illegitimate president twice.
This is a closing thought, but maybe something for another future podcast. But it's striking to me the way, because this is not just an American realignment. You see it happening all over the world in all sorts of different countries, particularly in Western Europe, although there are some places in the Middle East. Turkey is another perfect example. Trump and Erdogan bases and the way they were their political strategies almost perfectly mirror one another. Not in the way Obama and Trump do, but in the fact that Erdogan relies on a more religious, rural base of support, while the urban, suburban kind of areas of Turkey are dead set against the man. And so you see this realignment happening all over the world, but it's just striking to me how much more slowly America moves because of our system, because we have two parties, and so you have to wait for both parties to kind of reshuffle the deck of cards before they're ready to call it a day. Whereas in Europe or these other multi-party systems, they just make a new party, and then that party gradually grows pretty quickly until they wind up winning the elections, like the League in Italy or the AKP, I believe it is, in Turkey.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Sam, do you want to close us out? This is your shindig.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also subscribe on iTunes. And from all of us here at American Watchmen, thanks for listening and have a great night. So, yeah, we'll be back next week for another episode of the show.
Have a good night, y'all.